I never thought the woman I was about to marry would ask me to hand over part of my company to her parents as a wedding gift, but here we are. My name is Aaron. I'm 33, and I own a tech consulting business that I built from absolutely nothing. No inheritance, no trust fund, no wealthy relatives bailing me out when things got tough. Just me grinding 16-hour days in a cramped apartment for the first 3 years, living off ramen and refusing to quit when every rational person told me to get a real job. The company finally took off about 2 years ago. We landed a major contract with a healthcare network, then another with a logistics firm, and suddenly I had 12 employees, actual office space, and enough profit that I could finally breathe without checking my bank account every morning. I met Jenna about 18 months ago at a networking event. One of those sterile hotel ballroom situations where everyone pretends to care about each other's elevator pitches. But she was different, confident in a way that didn't feel forced, laughing at the absurdity of the whole scene. And when she walked up to me and said, "You look like you'd rather be literally anywhere else," I knew I liked her immediately. We started dating. Things moved fast. She was ambitious, driven, working in marketing for a mid-sized firm, and she seemed to understand the entrepreneur lifestyle in a way most people didn't, or at least I thought she did. 6 months in, I proposed at this little restaurant we'd gone to on our first real date. She said yes, and suddenly we were planning a wedding for the following spring, about 15 months away, which felt reasonable for getting everything organized. The wedding planning started simple enough, but Jenna gradually took control of every detail: the venue, the flowers, the catering, the guest list, and honestly, I didn't mind because I was slammed at work and she seemed to enjoy it. Plus, we weren't living together yet, so it made sense for her to handle the logistics from her apartment while I focused on a major project rollout. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, were pleasant enough on the surface, her mom always smiling and asking about the business, her dad mostly quiet but supportive. They lived about an hour away in a nice suburban house, not wealthy but comfortable, and they seemed genuinely happy that their daughter was marrying someone financially stable. About 3 months before the wedding, I started noticing small comments from Jenna, little remarks about how her parents had sacrificed so much for her education, how they deserved to enjoy their retirement, how family should take care of family. Nothing alarming on its own, just enough to make me think she was hinting that maybe I should help them out financially at some point, which I wasn't opposed to if it was reasonable and discussed properly. Then came the kitchen conversation that changed everything. We were at my place, making dinner together on a Thursday evening. She was chopping vegetables, and I was dealing with the chicken, and she brought it up so casually that I almost didn't catch the weight of what she was saying. "I've been thinking about a really meaningful gift we could give my parents," she said, not even looking up from the cutting board. I assumed she meant like a vacation or maybe helping with a home renovation, so I said sure. What did she have in mind? And that's when she dropped it. "What if we gifted them shares in your company? It would be such a beautiful gesture, showing them they're part of our future." I actually laughed because I thought she was joking, like this was some bit she was doing, but when I looked at her face I realized she was dead serious. The smile was still there, but her eyes were watching me carefully, waiting for my reaction, and I felt this cold drop in my stomach. I put down the knife I was holding and asked if she understood what she was actually suggesting, and she nodded like this was the most natural thing in the world, talking about how it's symbolic, how it shows respect, how it brings them into the family business. The word symbolic stuck with me because there's nothing symbolic about signing over actual equity in a company. That's real ownership, real voting rights, real financial stake, but she was framing it like giving someone a decorative plate. I tried to explain the reality of what she was asking for. How in an S-corp you can't just gift shares to people without serious legal implications and tax consequences. How her parents would literally own part of my business with rights to profits and potentially a say in major decisions depending on how the shares were structured. But she kept minimizing every point I made with that dismissive wave of her hand. She always did when she didn't like what she was hearing. She insisted I was overcomplicating it, that other people do this all the time, that it's just paperwork my lawyer could figure out. And when I explained that no, other people actually don't do this, that equity in a private company isn't some token you hand out at family gatherings, she switched tactics. She started talking about how they wouldn't interfere, how they wouldn't even know what to do with it, how it's just about the gesture, and that's when I realized she fundamentally didn't understand or didn't care to understand what she was actually asking for. The conversation went in circles for about 20 minutes, her insisting it was simple and meaningful, me trying to explain why this was an insane request, and the more I pushed back, the more I could see her getting frustrated, not sad or understanding. just annoyed that I wasn't immediately agreeing. Eventually, she dropped it with a tight-lipped response about how I should just think about it, and we finished making dinner in uncomfortable silence. That night, I barely slept, lying there staring at the ceiling and replaying the conversation in my head, trying to figure out where this had come from. We'd never discussed anything like this before. Her parents had never expressed any interest in my business beyond polite questions. So why now? Why 3 months before the wedding? Why framed as a gift instead of a straightforward conversation about financial planning? The more I thought about it, the more wrong it felt. Not just the request itself, but the way she presented it, casual and inevitable, like my agreement was just a formality. I'd worked 80-hour weeks to build this company. I'd risked everything I had. I'd signed personal guarantees on loans that would have destroyed me if things went south. And now she wanted me to just hand over a piece of that to people who had contributed nothing, not capital, not labor, not expertise, just because they were her parents. The next morning, she acted like nothing had happened, cheerful and affectionate, making coffee and talking about wedding RSVPs, and I almost convinced myself I'd overreacted, that maybe this was just a weird idea she'd drop once she thought about it more clearly. But something in my gut told me this conversation wasn't over, and I was right. She came back to it 3 days later while we were driving to finalize details with our wedding venue. Casual as anything, like she was asking me to pick up milk on the way home, asking if I'd thought more about the shares situation. I told her I had, and my answer was still no, that it wasn't happening, and I watched her jaw tighten for just a second before she forced a smile and said okay in this tone that clearly meant it wasn't okay. Over the next 2 weeks, she brought it up 6 more times, each approach slightly different, testing new pressure points like she was running experiments to see what would crack me. First, it was about connections, how her dad knew a city council member who could help if I ever needed permits or zoning changes, how her mom was in a book club with the CFO of a regional hospital chain that could become a massive client, framing the shares as a networking investment rather than a gift. When I pointed out that I'd built my client base without needing her parents' connections and didn't plan to start mixing family with business development, she switched tactics immediately. Then it became about our future, about how when we had kids we'd need her parents' help, how they'd want to be involved and supportive but would need to feel valued and included first. Like giving them equity now was some kind of down payment on future babysitting. The logic was so twisted I didn't even know where to start unpacking it. But what bothered me most was how calculated it all felt, like she'd sat down and mapped out every possible argument, every emotional lever she could pull. The real turning point came on a Saturday afternoon when I was at the office catching up on some project proposals. My phone rang, her mom's name on the screen, and that was unusual because Mrs. Carter and I had a perfectly pleasant but surface-level relationship, maybe a dozen conversations total. I answered expecting maybe some question about the wedding, but instead she opened with how she wanted to thank me personally for my incredibly generous idea. My stomach dropped because I had no idea what she was talking about, so I asked her to clarify, and she laughed this warm, grateful laugh that made everything worse, explaining how Jenna had told them I wanted to bring them into the business as a wedding gift, how touched they were, how much it meant to know I saw them as real partners in our future. I sat there in my office chair trying to process what I was hearing. Jenna had told them this was happening, had presented it as my idea, had gotten them excited and grateful for something I'd explicitly said no to, and now her mom was thanking me like it was a done deal. I managed to say something non-committal about still discussing details, but Mrs. Carter kept going, talking about how proud they were, how they'd always known Jenna would marry someone who understood the importance of family, and every word felt like another layer of trap closing around me. When I finally got off the phone, I just sat there staring at my computer screen, not seeing anything, trying to understand what game was being played here. She'd gone behind my back. She'd made promises using my company as currency. She'd created expectations with her parents that would now make me look like the bad guy when I said no. And she'd done it all without a single conversation with me about whether this was remotely acceptable. I called her immediately, told her we needed to talk now, not later, and when she showed up at my place an hour later, she had this defensive posture before I'd even said anything, arms crossed, standing in my doorway like she was ready for a fight. I confronted her about the phone call, about her mom thanking me for the generous gift of shares I was apparently giving them, and I watched something flicker across her face, not guilt exactly, more like annoyance that her plan had been exposed too early. She shrugged, actually shrugged, claiming she'd just mentioned we were considering it, that she didn't say it was definite. But that wasn't what her mom had said at all. Her mom had been crystal clear that this was happening, that I wanted to do this, and when I pointed that out, Jenna pivoted to offense. asking why I was making such a big deal out of this, insisting it was just shares, just a gesture, accusing me of acting like she was trying to steal my company. She said it with this exasperated tone, like I was being dramatic and unreasonable, like she was the victim of my overreaction rather than someone who'd just lied to her parents about a major financial commitment. I told her this wasn't about the value or the gesture. This was about her making decisions about my business without my consent, about her creating obligations I never agreed to, about her fundamentally not respecting that this company was mine and mine alone. She rolled her eyes, literally rolled her eyes at me, and started talking about how I was being selfish, how this is what people do when they get married. They merge their lives, they bring families together, they make sacrifices. The word sacrifices hit me wrong because this wasn't her sacrifice to make. She wasn't giving up anything. She was volunteering my work, my risk, my years of grinding, and calling it teamwork. The argument went on for another 30 minutes, circular and exhausting. Her insisting I was short-sighted and didn't understand how successful families operate. Me trying to explain that successful families don't operate through financial manipulation and broken boundaries. Eventually she left, slamming my apartment door hard enough that I heard my neighbor's dog start barking through the wall. I called Dave, my best friend since college, the guy who'd helped me move equipment when I was running the business out of my apartment, who'd listened to me stress about payroll and contracts and close calls for years. I told him everything, the initial request, the repeated pressure, the phone call with her mom, all of it. And when I finished, there was this long silence on his end before he finally spoke. He told me straight up that this was run for the hills bad, that this wasn't about shares, this was about her thinking she could manipulate me into anything if she just pushed hard enough. And what would happen when we were married and she wanted something else? Would I cave then too? I'd been thinking the same thing, but hearing someone else say it out loud made it real, made it impossible to rationalize away. That evening, Jenna sent me a text, no apology, just a simple message that felt more like an ultimatum than an olive branch, saying we needed to figure this out before the wedding, that either I did it or this relationship wouldn't work. I stared at that text for a long time, sitting on my couch in the dark, trying to remember when exactly things had shifted from partnership to hostage negotiation. She wasn't asking me to compromise. She wasn't suggesting we find middle ground. She was drawing a line and telling me to choose between my boundaries and my relationship, and the fact that she thought that was acceptable told me everything I needed to know. The morning after that ultimatum text, I made a decision that probably should have come weeks earlier. I called Olivia, the lawyer who'd helped me set up the business structure 3 years ago when I was drowning in paperwork trying to figure out LLCs versus S-Corp. She'd been straightforward then, no nonsense, didn't sugarcoat the complexities, and I needed that same energy now. I explained the situation, the request for shares, the pressure campaign, the promises Jenna had made to her parents, all of it. And when I finished, Olivia was quiet for a moment before she walked me through scenarios I hadn't even considered. Once her parents owned shares, they could potentially sell them to third parties depending on the operating agreement. They'd have rights to financial information and could dispute business decisions. And in the event of a divorce, which she said I should absolutely be considering now, those shares could become leverage in settlement negotiations. Even if they seemed nice and uninvolved at the moment, I'd be giving them legal power over my company. And based on what she'd heard about my fiancé's behavior, did I really think they wouldn't use that power if things went south? The way she laid it out made my blood run cold because I'd been so focused on the principle of the thing, the disrespect and manipulation, that I hadn't fully thought through the practical disasters waiting down that road. Olivia spent the next 20 minutes explaining how to protect the business legally, making sure the operating agreement was ironclad, documenting everything in writing. And she said something that stuck with me about how the best defense isn't just legal documents. It's being willing to walk away from people who don't respect your boundaries. That no prenup in the world will save you if you marry someone who thinks your assets are community property before you even say I do. I thanked her, paid her consultation fee, and sat in my car outside her office building trying to figure out how I'd gotten here, 3 months from a wedding with deposits already paid on the venue, the photographer, the catering, all of it non-refundable. And I was questioning everything about the person I'd planned to spend my life with. The financial hit from canceling would be significant, probably close to $15,000 down the drain, but that seemed like nothing compared to what I'd lose if I went through with marrying someone who operated like this. That evening, I drove to Jenna's apartment, the one she'd been staying at more often since our fight, and I knew before I even knocked on the door that this conversation would end one of two ways. Either she'd back down completely and apologize, or this relationship was over. She opened the door looking tired, like she hadn't been sleeping well either, and for a second I felt bad, felt like maybe I was being too rigid, but then I remembered her mom's phone call, the lies, the manipulation, and that sympathy evaporated. We sat in her living room, and I told her clearly, no room for interpretation, that I would not be giving her parents shares in my company. Not now, not ever, not as a wedding gift or an investment or a symbolic gesture, that this was my final answer, and the conversation was closed. I watched her face go through several emotions, surprise that I was this definitive, anger that I wasn't budging, and then something cold settled into her expression. She told me I was being selfish and greedy, that this is exactly why people say entrepreneurs are terrible partners, that I cared more about my business than the people in my life. And I let her finish, waited until she was done, and then I said what I'd been avoiding saying for weeks. This isn't love, Jenna. This is entitlement. You don't respect what I've built, you don't respect my decisions, and you don't respect me enough to be honest with your own parents. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to decide if there was an angle left to play, some way to turn this around. But I'd made up my mind, and she could tell. She said we were done then, and I agreed. And just like that, 3 months before our wedding, the relationship was over. I pulled the engagement ring from my pocket, the one she'd left at my place the week before during another argument, and set it on her coffee table between us before I walked out. The aftermath was messier than I expected. Her parents called me within 2 days, confused and hurt, saying Jenna had told them I'd changed my mind suddenly, and they didn't understand why. I kept it simple, told them there had been a miscommunication, that the shares were never actually offered, and I was sorry they'd been misled. And I could hear the disappointment in Mrs. Carter's voice, but also something else, maybe a hint that she knew her daughter had overstepped. The next few days were a blur of cancellation calls, explaining to the venue coordinator, the caterer, the photographer that the wedding was off, and watching those non-refundable deposits disappear one by one. Mutual friends started reaching out, asking what happened, and I realized Jenna was controlling the narrative, painting herself as the victim of my cold businessman routine. Then she posted something on social media, nothing explicit, just a vague statement about how some people value money over relationships, and how she dodged a bullet with someone who couldn't prioritize family. And I watched it get dozens of sympathetic comments from people who had no idea what actually happened. For about a week, I debated responding, setting the record straight publicly. But then Emily, a mutual friend who'd actually bothered to ask my side, told me that several people had already figured it out. Jenna had been telling different versions of the story to different people, and they weren't adding up. Plus, everyone who actually knew me knew I wasn't the greedy type, that there had to be more to it. She was right. Within 2 weeks, the social media post had been deleted. Some of Jenna's closer friends had quietly reached out to apologize for jumping to conclusions, and the whole thing faded into the background noise of everyone's lives. I focused on work, threw myself into a new project with a client I'd been chasing for months, and slowly the weight of those last few months started lifting. Dave took me out for drinks one Friday night, sat across from me at our usual bar, and reminded me that I'd dodged a nuclear bomb, that if I'd married her, and then she pulled this kind of thing with something even bigger, my life would have been destroyed. I knew he was right because I'd seen exactly who Jenna was when she didn't get what she wanted, manipulative, dishonest, willing to damage my reputation to protect her ego, and that person would have made my life miserable. Sitting here now, 6 months after everything fell apart, I can say with complete certainty that ending that relationship was the best decision I ever made. The business is doing better than ever. I just signed 2 new major contracts. My team has grown to 18 people, and I'm not looking over my shoulder wondering what I'll be pressured to give up next. That $15,000 in lost deposits turned out to be the cheapest lesson I ever learned about the importance of boundaries and recognizing manipulation when you see it. I didn't lose a fiancé. I dodged a lifetime of someone treating my life's work as something she could trade away to make her family happy, and honestly, that's worth celebrating. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.